I always say that the BBC has been involved in a long-term grooming process of the British nation. And we have been groomed by the BBC to accept all sorts of things which are actually very bad for us. So I agree with you that the idea that broadcasting does not affect culture is ludicrous, utterly ludicrous.
Mr. Robin Aitken, what a joy to talk to you again. Anybody who hasn't heard of you, well, they need to catch up. You were, of course, a correspondent with the BBC. You were on Radio 4 Today programme, in fact, right at the heart of things. You're an author, you're a commentator, all-round really interesting guy, and it's great to have you back joining us. Please say hi to our viewers and our listeners.
Tony, thank you for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be back with you.
So you know from the inside what goes on at the BBC, what the culture's like, and you'll also be very aware of what's been happening recently in terms of accusations of bias, in terms of accusations of embedded bias, and indeed Michael Prescott's, another internal person's review of what's going on. I don't want to bother with the edited video clips. That is one thing, and it's a very big thing. I'm more concerned with things like internal bias around pro and anti-family agendas, etc., and what can and can't be said and what should and shouldn't be promoted on a national broadcaster. And before I get into the detail, I'm just wondering from your experience, which wasn't that long ago, what was your feel on the inside in terms of those things?
I believe, because it was my personal experience, that the BBC has very strong, embedded, consistent biases, if you like to call them that. I prefer the term of a worldview. I think the BBC sees itself actually as a progressive organisation, and I use that word advisedly. It is progressive in the sense that it has embraced all those campaigns which progressives say they support, things like abortion, looser divorce laws, a whole range of moral issues where the BBC has a very distinct view on things. It extends beyond that, of course, because it does extend into the directly political sphere. So the Trump thing's interesting because I was aware back in 2015 when Trump first appeared on the scene just how strong was the BBC's aversion to him. I mean, this thing with the latest scandal around the Panorama edit is nothing new. The BBC has a long, consistent anti-Trump stance, and that is because he stands for things which they believe are wrong and wicked. So, for instance, one of the things which Trump did, as you know, it was to appoint conservatives onto the Supreme Court in the US. And that led in turn to rulings on issues which progressive left feel strongly about, like access to abortion clinics and things like that. And the BBC, as a progressive organisation, takes that into account when it reports on Trump, and they don't like him.
You're absolutely right. And I remember discussions at the time, and I don't want to focus on Trump, and I know he's a divisive figure, but the important thing to note is that, well, the whole country of the USA is split 50-50, right? So I remember at the time in 2016, and there was a programme broadcast, and I forget what it was, from the BBC, analysing the fact that, well, actually on the Today programme, none of the senior editors or producers were Trump supporters, or indeed supporters of the right of centre. And their point was, well, that doesn't matter because we're objective. And it seems to me that, well, the trouble is you're then saying that things like cognitive bias, unconscious bias don't apply to you because you're somehow better than everybody else. And clearly the evidence would suggest that has not been the case. And other figures. So we know over the last decade or more that And again, this is just an observation. The number of LGBT identifying staff in the BBC has been, around the 12% mark, and especially prominent in terms of editorial staff, senior management. So the people who commission programmes. And the point would be that that's many multiples of what you'd find in the general population. So it's unsurprising that the general sway will be towards more editorial decisions which are in favour of those things, fewer which are anti. And indeed, we have reported accusations in The Guardian and other places that there in fact is an LGBT committee which kind of vetoes anti-stories. I think the one cited was anti-trans stories and promotes pro-trans stories throughout the whole of the corporation. So those things kind of exist. I wonder if you've got any comment, any reflection on why that's there, maybe.
So within BBC circles, they use an expression which I think is quite telling. So they don't talk about bias, but they talk of revealed preferences. One way in which a bias will show itself is in story selection, and then to a certain extent simplification. So if you are somebody who is on the progressive liberal left, and it is your duty, let us say, to compile a news bulletin, which stories do you select for inclusion? Are you going to select, for instance, if given a choice between, given that every bulletin has limited space, so you're always up against the time pressure. So you can't include everything. Are you going to include the story about, let us imagine a story, a success for a free speech advocate in the UK having won a court battle, or a story about so-called reproductive rights in the US state of Georgia? The point is that those two stories, despite your professional intention to be impartial, in fact, those stories will be of differential interest to you. One of them will come down, that's the story of which you approve of, you're interested in it. The other story maybe goes against the grain. That's how a particular kind of bias in the output arises, because people, all of us, one has to be candid about this. I mean, I am not impartial, and I don't say that I am. I have my own preferences and predilections. I have my own beliefs from which those biases arise. So I am not impartial. And I think very, very few people are. In fact, it's interesting when you consider which are those professions where we demand, or hope for at least, impartiality. There's the judiciary, where we expect our judges to, without fear or favour, make judgment on people. Counselling is another one, where psychological counsellors are taught not to be judgmental when they're talking to people about their personal problems. So we expect counsellors to be impartial. Now, to extend that to journalism, I think is a stretch. For one thing, journalists, almost by their nature, tend to be people with political views. I mean, it's unusual. Of course, there are sports journalists, I dare say, or there are people in specialist forms of journalism who perhaps are not very political. But if you're talking about the mainstream of journalism, the sort of journalism I did on the Today programme, for instance, there would be very, very few of my colleagues who would not have a view on something like raising taxes or something like the trans issue. People in those kind of jobs have strong views almost by definition. To then expect them always to set those views aside when they're making decisions about stories, about which stories to cover and who to interview on that story, is a big demand. And I think that with the best will in the world, it's not always done successfully.
Yeah, and you raised some very interesting points about judiciary, which again has been in the news in terms of bias, and we haven't got time to go down that road, I suppose. But it's a really interesting one, the effect of cognitive bias, and who wrote the book Thinking Fast and Slow. A very, very long but interesting book to read in terms of just covering the whole area of bias, even to the degree that larger sentences were handed out in courtrooms that had larger or greater value numbers displayed on the wall than in courtrooms that had lower value numbers displayed on the wall. Quite remarkable, but such is the case apparently. Anyway, we can't do much about that, but I'm keen to know what can we do about the BBC now. One of the things I'm interested in is kind of individual trait analysis, and there are different people have different traits, and we've got this classic idea of the left and the right in politics, and I'm not sure I'm much more right and wrong than left and right, let's put it that way. But there is this notion of the left and the right, and when you look at things like trait analysis, it's quite interesting, because people who fall on the left of the political spectrum are generally speaking more openness. They have a higher degree of openness from a trait classical big five trait analysis. They have a higher degree of openness, and that's interesting because it means they're open to new experiences. They've got open minds. They don't like borders around their thought process. They don't like borders around other things like sexuality. They don't like borders around countries. Generally speaking, they're happy to think out of the box, whereas that's often not the case in more conventional thoughts. So if you look at people right of the political divide, they're generally more conventional. They're less open to change and new ideas. Now, of course, the arts and the media attract people who are very good at the more open way of thinking. So you'd expect, it's almost like, well, it's kind of built into the process, isn't it, really? So given that, and that may or may not be part of the situation, the reason we are where we are, I mean, how do we get to a place where I don't know whether it's above my pay grade to decide whether the BBC should remain a licence fee funded organisation or whether it should be completely privatised or what. But something clearly needs to change, and many director generals have had a go and it doesn't seem to have worked out. So from your point of view, I wonder, is it fixable, and if it is, how?
Well, that thing that you have just raised about traits in on the left and the right, it's very interesting, and I have also heard and read about that. And of course, presented in the way you have, it would seem like an insurmountable obstacle to ever achieving anything like impartiality at the BBC. And I do believe there is a lot in that. So is there any way of fixing the BBC? Well, one thing that strikes me about all the recent scandals in the BBC over the past decade and more is that the BBC's approach was always to handle these problems internally. So you have a system, the BBC is very jealous of its prerogatives, and so when there's a problem, what it does, it has internal structures, and believe me, it has labyrinthine internal structures for investigating and adjudicating on things that happen within the corporation. Now, I think that model has been tested to destruction, because Tim Davie, after all, I think it's fair to say this. I think that from people who know Davie, I don't know him myself, but other people I know who do know him, say that he was quite sincere in when he first came into the job in 2020. He said his priority was to re-establish the BBC's reputation for impartiality. And I believe he was sincere in that, but he's been unable to do it. And I think that one of the reasons for that is because the BBC marks its own homework in these matters.
Right.
It would be much better if, instead of an internal instead of an internal process, you had a process which was adjudicated by outsiders. So I don't say this is this is not a complete answer to the BBC's problems, because the problem that you raise about the BBC attracting people who have a particular mindset, those particular traits which make them open and always keen for progress and innovation and overturning tradition, it's very difficult to see how that can be overcome. But on this narrow point about what happens when things go wrong, having an external body would be a step forward. Now, I don't mean Ofcom, because Ofcom has proved itself to be limp-wristed when it comes to dealing with the BBC. And actually, part of the problem there is that so many Ofcom people are ex-BBC themselves. They look with some favour on the BBC, a lot of them. I think they're much too soft on the BBC. What I'm thinking about, suppose this Prescott, so when Prescott drew up his dossier, if that had been given not to a BBC internal committee, suppose it had been given to an external body comprising of, say, some hard-headed journalists who don't owe any allegiance to the BBC, maybe a lawyer or two, whatever, maybe a lay person, a mix of people who would look at that and come to a common sense view about whether there had been bias or not. That would be a much more secure way of arriving at a fair decision about such a thing. As I say, it's not a complete answer to the BBC's problems, but it would go some way towards solving that problem.
Very interesting. And other people have suggested actually you can't split the Director General role because, of course, you need one head of the BBC, but actually you could separate the running of the organisation and the measuring of the organisation from the talent side, maybe. So the two things were different,
That's actually been done before. So Michael Checkland, who was who came from a non-journalistic side of the business, and he put John Birt in, and John Birt was a disaster for BBC journalism, in my view. John. So this is going back over ancient history, really, Tony. But I would say this: that one of the fateful decisions, which was made back in the 1990s, was when John Birt dissolved the frontier between news and current affairs. Now, I'm of a generation of BBC journalists who was brought up under a system where we, in our minds, and in fact, there was a distinction between news and current affairs. The current affairs journalists were separate from us news chaps. I was a news chap. And the idea was that news would provide a factual summary of events without comment.
Right.
So in the old journalistic declension, something that we were all brought up on was, there are 5 questions we always ask: who, what, where, when, why. Okay. Who, what, where, when? Those are facts. Why? That's a different matter. Why is a question of interpretation. Now, Birt came up with this idea, the mission to explain. He said that journalism was no use unless journalists themselves explained why things had happened. Now, the problem with that is that it opens up an area of interpretation. And in that area of interpretation, one is not talking about established facts or facts that can be established, let's put it that way. One is talking about conjecture and speculation about why things happened. That's actually, in my view, that was a fateful decision which led to a lot of the problems that we're now seeing in the BBC, because there is too much scope for BBC journalists to put their own interpretation on why things happen.
Yeah, and in fairness, it's not just the BBC. Most news organisations now interview their own people with their own people and talk about the news as opposed to reporting the news. Yeah, you're absolutely right. How profound. And you've written about this and a lot of other things in your book, The Noble Liar. If anybody hasn't read that, oh, come on. Available in all good bookshops, and they really should do that. I think the work you did was good. I think the basic premise of the BBC, the idea is a good one. Whether or not that can actually work out in practice, well, let's wait and see. And I think I had an interaction with the BBC recently, which was very interesting because some people on the programme were saying, well, actually, of course, laws and media don't influence culture. And you think, are you absolutely crazy?
That is such nonsense.
It is complete nonsense because, I know so many people who read whatever the paper may be, might be The Guardian or something else like that, and they believe everything they read, or they read The Telegraph, and they listen to the BBC and they believe everything they hear.
Of course.
Without questioning.
Yeah, of course. I always say that the BBC has been involved in a long-term grooming process.
Well, that's interesting.
The British nation. And we have been groomed by the BBC to accept all sorts of things which are actually very bad for us. So I agree with you that the idea that broadcasting does not affect culture is ludicrous. Utterly ludicrous.
Yeah, and it's our concern because when it comes down to things like the sorts of relationships which bring about the best outcomes for kids and adults and wider society, you'd think your national broadcaster would talk a lot more about that than other things which empirically have much worse outcomes. But hey ho, we're not there yet. Robin, it's such a joy to talk to you as ever. Keep up the great work and look forward to speaking again.
Many thanks, Tony. It's always a pleasure. Thank you.